Recording in progress.
Okay, I want to follow up on the the video I did a couple of days ago about fundamental rights and natural rights and how you claim them under duress. I just want to run through a couple of things. Um, First of all, generally speaking, I feel that someone has a right to the property and recognition for things they did with their own labor rather than what was simply given to them. So that is, I guess essentially part of capitalism. It also kind of suggests ableism, because if you believe in to each according to his needs, well, you kind of have to do that within the context of a family or a tribe. So yeah, that's kind of a conservative belief, and maybe it's a little bit troubled. Um, we went through a few things like being born into advantageous circumstances is not in itself a natural right. We talked about justification clauses for a natural right and operational clauses. And we've also talked about the Second Amendment in the past, how and the Heller decision in 2008, the militia part, the Supreme Court said you don't need anymore because it's obsolete. So the only question was the operation, which meant um, that the ability of someone to defend themselves in their own home or defend their property or their family means that they um, can keep a weapon loaded. Um, so let's just go on down through. One of the most important things is the right to have agency as you are, and we talked about that. And in my own history, that started at William and Mary in 1961, in that meeting when I told the dean right after Thanksgiving that I thought I was a latent homosexual. That was a label. And at the time, that was a label that kind of today would maybe go along with gender theory or something. It could theoretically. But at the time, I was accused of pinning the label on myself and having to live with the consequences. The need for it sort of implied that I needed upward affiliation with other men. And that sort of implied that I wasn't open to the social activities that you needed to date and eventually relate to women and have children and have a family, which would enable you more easily to provide for other people to justify your place in the world. And you have to be really creative if you um, don't have the inclination essentially to reproduce yourself and start a family. And that's something we've covered before. But that, we came out of that. I went on, came back home, eventually graduated from GW, eventually went to graduate school. And the next big issue that came up was the issue of freedom from servitude. Well, that was the big issue in those days was the draft, the military draft during the Vietnam War. And I remember wanting my education help me get out of a combat assignment. That was the whole question of student deferments and then how much education you had and how much the country needed you. And with brain work was something I played, and that was a big part of my military service. But I also had a real problem with and during basic training with wound up in special training company and so forth. But I got to see people who were much more challenged than I was as physical males, which gives me some insight today, having seen this in the Army, how to interpret today's debate. Um, the then as I moved on in my life. Um, as an adult and started working in 1970, I decided, I came out a second time. I had that second, what I called my second coming, that's described in the book. And I needed to meet people. I wasn't as attractive as most of the other men, so I needed access to meeting a lot of people in order to find somebody that would work. And so mobility mattered, and this was happening at the time of the gasoline shortage after the Arab oil embargo of 1973. But and I was having to travel a lot for work to Minnesota. At the time, it was getting in the way. But eventually, I moved into the city, into New York City in 1974. Ironically, the job I had at NBC started the day that President Ford, right after Nixon resigned, which was kind of interesting. Um, but then of course, New York City was having its troubles. Remember, Ford city dropped dead. I wondered if the city would be a stable enough place, but it turned out it was, and it turned out I had a pretty interesting life for 4.5 years in New York City. But something happened in 1978 that made me concerned about how I would relate to somebody if I thought they had a medical problem. Again, I talked to Ward about the upward affiliation, and I sort of left the problem by moving to Dallas and starting a new life in 1979. And that was ironically would kind of give me a couple of years a year or two later to deal with the AIDS crisis that would come, which would come to Dallas about a year or so later than did to New York and Los Angeles, and it probably saved my life. But at the time, we were at the time wanting to get rid of sodomy laws. Remember, that was a big deal in the 1980s, and of course, the AIDS epidemic in the hands of the religious right gave them the ammunition they needed. They could make all kinds of theories. Of course, the blood supply was one thing, but they could make all kinds of other theories about how somehow this might endanger the general public, which they did. It was almost a very bad expansion of the sodomy law passed in Texas in 1983. So fortunately, it failed. Um, but I remember the group, the Dallas Doctors Against AIDS, and actually letters to them and everything. Um, but this got into the right of privacy, and I kind of felt that the right of privacy is the most important personal right of all, because it meant essentially to me that you couldn't criminalize something if you couldn't prove that the act had occurred, and something that happens in private between consenting adults you couldn't regulate. Well, that would be an operational concern in terms of the law, due process law. That would be an operational rather than a justification clause, probably. But it wouldn't be until remember Hardwick versus Bowers, and that decision, which was based on the Georgia sodomy law, which was both straight and gay, but one of the judges said there was no such thing as a right to homosexual sodomy. Remember, I think that was Berger in 1986. But eventually that would be overturned in 2003 in Lawrence versus Texas. And some of us are concerned with recently with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, and the Justices Alito and of course Thomas questioning substantive due processing. We were concerned that they could go back and take down the sodomy law and even contraception, and of course gay marriage later. Um, the sodomy law was overturned in 2003. The gay marriage, well, then the next big thing that happened was the overturning of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which I feel like I had a lot to do with, and that's the story of my books. And again, the idea was the right to privacy that in practice, most service members, except when they're deployed in combat, most of them, when they're stateside or in a reasonably stable place, have a life off base, and they should be able to have the same life and have relationships with consenting adults that anyone else did. And that was the basis of it. That was not that easy an argument to make back in 1993, and it took a long time to overturn, remember. Then I wrote that book explaining that, and then it became a series of 3 books. And then the whole idea, there were lots of questions about my speech. First of all, just as a book, when I was working for a company that serviced the military, that led to my going to Minneapolis to join a different part of the company. And then as I started putting it on the internet for people to read, there were questions about the issue, the nature of the issue, the military policy, kind of touched a lot of other issues like security clearances and discrimination in employment in other areas, maybe teachers or firemen. There used to be a question about fire personnel back in the 1970s, for example, in intimate associations, just like there was for the military. That went away, but there used to be a question. And because it could expand to other areas, I started writing about a lot of other areas, and I found out writing about free speech itself. Particularly, I became a plaintiff in the Child Online Protection Act case, which had a lot to do with forcing users possibly to prove they were adults before they logged on. That was declared unconstitutional in 2007. I had a role in that. But the other big question about citizen journalism, there are a couple of other big questions that have come up. One of them is, if you see yourself as a citizen journalist, do you have to make a living at it? Some people would say you do. Otherwise, you're driving other people out of work who actually are professional journalists. That would be a question. Or they would say your speech is gratuitous. And particularly now with all the polarization, the only purpose it might serve is to drive other people into bad behavior and maybe attack marginalized groups. And that idea has been a much more serious problem recently, particularly for me. And I can't seem to keep this phone. Oh, well, I can't seem to keep this phone connected. Um, so as you go on further, some other things would happen. Even though I didn't have my own children, I wound up, my mother's health became a big issue, and that was a big issue for me back in the 90s. It might have interfered with my move to Minneapolis. The filial responsibility, people who don't have their own children often have to take care of other people in a family, and particularly that carries through if you inherit an estate or something. So just having children doesn't mean that not having children doesn't mean that these other things don't affect you. Um, and I'm really trying to get this thing to come back. Well, I can't get it to come back. That email seemed to disappear. But anyway, that that is the main part of what I wanted to show, to talk about today. And I'll probably have to continue this discussion later soon. But I do thank you for listening.